There's an arrow in the middle of my screen saying, push the arrow, it says live. I don't have to touch that, do I?
Maybe I should start?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Laetitia is starting the live.
Okay.
Let's read the chat. I can't see my chat.
OK. Chers partenaires, chers publics de la Nuit des Idées à Toronto et à Winnipeg. Before starting, I would like to acknowledge that we are located on traditional territories. The territories include the Wendat, Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that Luann Neal, who is taking part in this keynote panel, is located on the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen people, the Songhees, Esquimalt, and the Uneshek people. Nous sommes ravis de vous retrouver pour cette 4e édition de la Nuit des Idées au Canada. Événement international qui encourage la libre circulation des pensées et des savoirs dans plus de 75 pays sur 5 continents. L'année qui s'est écoulée nous a obligés à revoir nos habitudes, à réinventer nos façons de faire et nos manières d'être. Elle a aussi été l'occasion de nous arrêter un instant et de nous interroger, de repenser ensemble, de discuter. Et c'est bien l'objet de notre rendez-vous annuel, l'échange et la réflexion collective mondiale. Pour cette nouvelle édition, l'Institut français nous a proposé de nous interroger sur la notion de proximité. À l'heure où de nombreuses frontières sont fermées, où on ne peut plus se rassembler et où la distanciation physique est de rigueur, que signifie être proche les uns des autres? En même temps, les frontières n'ont jamais empêché la circulation des idées, ou que des êtres humains situés à 1000 lieues se sentir proches. Et les frontières dont je vous parle ne sont pas toutes étatiques, car nous en avons d'autres, les barrières linguistiques, la démarcation sociétale, la séparation spatiale imposée par les quartiers que l'on peut habiter selon nos ressources, nos moyens, et les divergences induites par le capital culturel de chacun, par exemple. Je ne vais pas faire un discours ici entre l'homme solitaire et l'homme solidaire, mais je veux simplement dire que les frontières et les distances ne nous ont jamais empêchés de se sentir proches avec nos semblables, de comprendre les larmes des personnes opprimées, se lier avec les défenseurs des causes les plus justes, se ranger aux côtés des femmes et des hommes dont un simple regard nous font plonger dans l'essence même de l'humanité. Les mots, les idées et les arts ont cette particularité de ne pas connaître de frontières. Et cette nuit des idées particulières, 100% virtuelle, le montre bien, avec des discussions de fond sur des sujets qui animent nos sociétés, que ce soit en France, au Canada ou ailleurs dans le monde. Des performances artistiques rendues possibles par la technologie, même aujourd'hui, même en période de confinement, être partout à la fois, de repousser les limites de la création, c'est possible. Et les témoignages inspirants d'artistes et intellectuels que vous allez entendre ce soir achèvent de me convaincre de cela. Cette crise, nous pouvons la traverser avec sagesse et avec humanité, avec ingéniosité et demeurer optimiste. J'espère que vous serez convaincus également. Je tiens aussi à remercier d'abord toute l'équipe du service culturel du consulat ici à Toronto, de l'Alliance française de Toronto et l'Alliance française du Manitoba, qui travaillent depuis plusieurs mois, je le sais parce que je les vois au fond du couloir, mais aussi, ils ont aussi été à télétravail la plupart du temps, pendant de longs mois, pour concevoir cette édition de la Nuit des idées en ligne, en lien avec tout le réseau de notre ambassade, qui organise cette même Nuit des idées dans 13 autres villes au Canada ce soir, avec 28 heures de contenu en ligne, évidemment gratuit et ouvert à tous. Merci aussi à nos partenaires qui nous accompagnent année après année et nous aident à diffuser le meilleur de la culture française au Canada. Ce soir, je tiens particulièrement à remercier le Musée des droits de l'homme et de la personne de Winnipeg, le Centre national pour la vérité et la réconciliation de Winnipeg également, AGO, la Art Gallery of Ontario, l'Institut pour la citoyenneté canadienne, le Royal British Columbia Museum, l'Université Paris-Descartes, l'UFT, Opéra Atelier, le Centre de musique baroque de Versailles, le Festival mural de Montréal, l'Art Cultural Resources, l'Association pour le rayonnement de l'Opéra de Paris, la Power Plant Gallery, Agnès Etherington Art Gallery at Queen's University à Kingston, le McLaren Art Center à Barrie, le Philosophy Meetup Club de Toronto, les artistes Josephine Bacon, Kim O. Bamsawin, Hologramme, Kim Thuy, et les intervenants français qui ont accepté de jouer le jeu de cette nuit à distance avec nous. Alors, ils sont nombreux aussi, je vais les citer, Clément Balou, Dark Claffin, Lise Santoro, Pierre Godard, Benkadi Emmanuelier et Saskia Cousin. Et bien entendu, merci à vous aussi d'être en ligne avec nous ce soir. J'ai donc le plaisir, immense plaisir, je devrais dire, d'ouvrir cette nuit des idées à Toronto et à Winnipeg avec une conversation qui s'annonce passionnante sur la question de la décolonisation et en particulier de la restitution des œuvres d'art acquises pendant la période coloniale et conservées dans les collections des musées aux peuples et communautés dont elles sont issues. C'est une question très actuelle en France puisque le gouvernement français vient de voter une loi actant la restitution d'œuvres d'art et d'artefacts conservés dans les collections nationales françaises au Bénin et au Sénégal. Comment la question de la restitution s'intègre dans la question plus large de la réconciliation est également une question éminemment actuelle, ici au Canada bien sûr, avec la Commission Vérité et Réconciliation, et les initiatives menées par les provinces pour la restitution d'œuvres d'art d'autochtones, mais aussi en France, où un célèbre historien, Benjamin Stora, vient de remettre un rapport au gouvernement français sur la réconciliation avec l'Algérie, où cette question de réconciliation, de comment devenir plus proche pour écrire ensemble une histoire commune, postcoloniale, devient, on le sent, tout à fait centrale. Alors, quand Benjamin Stora a remis ce rapport, le président de la République s'est engagé, sur la base de ce travail, de faire mettre plusieurs initiatives concrètes afin d'avancer sur un chemin de reconnaissance de toutes les mémoires et d'apaisement. Et je vous le dis aussi en tant que personne, moi-même née et élevée à Pondichéry, un ancien comptoir de la France, que ce travail sera mené par mon gouvernement en toute sincérité. D'éminentes spécialistes de ces questions sont avec nous ce soir. Je les salue et je vous remercie, mesdames, d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Alors, qui sont-elles? Wanda Nanibush, directrice des collections autochtones de la Art Gallery of Ontario, Louane Neal, directrice des collections autochtones du Royal British Columbia Museum, et Saskia Cousin, anthropologue et professeure à l'Université de Paris-Descartes. Et pour aller au fond de ce débat, j'ai l'immense honneur de laisser la parole à l'un des plus brillants intellectuels canadiens, mon ami John Ralston Saul, qui animera ce débat. John Ralston Saul is somebody who doesn't need any introduction. But since I'm asked, to do the job by my team, I think I'd better do it, John.
Short.
Sorry. He's been very modest. John is an award-winning essayist and novelist. His work of ideas, history, and philosophy are constantly being reissued and translated for a broad readership, as well as taught around the world. He is co-chair of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship and 6 Degrees, a global movement on citizenship and immigration. He's President Emeritus of PEN International, the only Canadian writer elected to this position in 97 years. In The Collapse of Globalism, John predicted the 2007 economic crisis years before it happened, as well as the current rise of populism and xenophobia. Declared as a prophet by Time magazine, his 14 works have now been translated into 28 languages in over 37 countries. In his 2008 bestseller, A Fair Country, Telling Truths About Canada, John argues about many things that are important for us, all of us. He says that Canada has been heavily influenced and shaped by Indigenous ideas, including an original approach to egalitarianism, a taste for social complexity, a constant balancing of inclusion, and everything that goes along with it. This has encouraged for me a lot of positive attitudes towards immigration in Canada. A Fair Country is part of an argument which began with reflections of a Siamese twin and was brought to a conclusion in his most recent book, John, that I had the pleasure of reading quite a few months ago, The Comeback. Thank you, dear John. I'm looking forward to this passionate conversation with you.
Well, thank you very much, Tudor. And si je peux dire deux mots en français, merci à vous, au consulat et à tout le monde dans le monde francophone, en France et au Canada, qui ont rendu possible cet événement et les autres événements. C'est très important. Et nous sommes tous ravis de faire part, malgré le fait que ça se passe en anglais, ça prouve que les langues qui ont une vie internationale fait partie d'un multilinguisme extrêmement important. So this is a very exciting gathering. And I want to just start very quickly because the Canadians who are watching won't want this or need this, but the non-Canadians might be interested because Saskia and I were talking about the land acknowledgements yesterday, and just a word, which is that this move towards doing land acknowledgements in non-Indigenous, almost all major public events across Canada. I don't know, it started probably about 10 years ago and then really started moving seriously out of the west of Canada across the country after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And now it's pretty well everywhere at major public events. And some people complain, well, it's always being repeated. It's always more or less the same thing, except it's different in each community because the people on the land, the people from the land are different in each place. But of course, nobody says that when they bring the mace into Parliament and a mere room becomes the heart of democracy every day, and they take it away when there's a riot, and that means it's no longer Parliament. Nobody says how boring, you do this every day. Nobody who goes to church complains that the Mass is identical for thousands of years. So, what this land acknowledgement really is, among other things, is it's the attempt to introduce a narrative to this northern half of Northern America, which starts from who was here before the settlers came, and what is the nature of their relationship to the land, and therefore what is our relationship to them, and how does that all fit together into the Indigenous philosophical ideas of oneness, of us being part of the land, and with the land, as opposed to being in the Cartian sense above the land and giving it orders. So it's the introduction of an argument of a new narrative, of a kind of long-term ritual, a repetition with content. And let me just add, so you know there are a lot of words attached to this which do not come out of European philosophy. That's the most important thing to understand about it. They're not a subsection of European philosophy. I was very struck when George Erasmus, the great Indigenous leader from the north, I think he lives in Yellowknife, in an introduction to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which he co-chaired, 1996 came out, and he wrote this one-page thing, which begins this way: Canada is a test case for a grand notion. So, you know, I come out of the Western tradition. I kept thinking it was nation. I had to read it 3 times before I realized it was notion. And then the second sentence, the notion that dissimilar peoples can share lands, resources, power, and dreams while respecting and sustaining their differences. So this is a very interesting argument. It is not a 18th, 19th century European American argument about the nature of the nation state and the nature of where legitimacy comes from. It's a completely different argument. And that lies at the heart of a lot of the not said things that you might hear today. So Tudor has introduced our guests, and let me just add to that, you know, yes, I'll start with the furthest away, Saskia, who's speaking today. I believe you're in Dakar, right? You're in Senegal, is that right?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Great, and he's from there in many ways, as I've understood, and she, of course, is a professor at Paris, but she's also doing this amazing work with a group of other people on otherness and how that ties into repatriation of cultural objects of Benin, Cameroon, Mali, and Senegal. And then the next furthest away, although I don't know that there's that much difference because Vancouver's a long, long way from Toronto, Luan Neal is actually from up the coast, the west coast, just before you get to the north end of Vancouver Island. And she's a Kwakwa Kewok artist from Alert Bay, which I've been to, and she and I've talked about that. And her family, going back to her family, have been great artists on both sides. And she creates in many different forms. And she's now, as you were told, at the Royal BC Museum in their Indigenous collections, and is really leading a whole new approach towards repatriation. And they've produced a booklet, which she'll talk about, which is a very important thing, which is having an influence in museums across Canada. And then third, in our hometown in a way, Wanda Nanibush is Anishinaabe and from Beausoleil First Nation, which is what, 2.5 hours north of here?
Yeah, approximately.
Just north, up Georgian Bay. She's been for quite some time now at the Art Gallery of Ontario. She's of course an artist, and she is a writer. A book, The Violence No More. The book Violence No More, The Rise of Indigenous Women. And she has really, I can say this, she has really been an enormous force in helping turn the AGO into one of the leaders, if not the leader, but everybody's competing to be a leader in this area, in how do you put together what you might call the Indigenous idea of objects and presence and art and more. How do you put that together with the Western idea of the artist for themselves, which comes out of the US and Europe? And so she's got it to a point where nearly 1/3 of the artists featured at the AGO are Indigenous. And I can tell you it's an explosive reinvention of how you present art, one, but how you rethink what you mean when you say art. And it is no longer art as defined by the Western tradition of the art historian, the footnoter, and the linearist. It's a very different approach. And I find it, personally, I go there and I exclaim out loud with excitement at what's happening. And it's happening in many regions. Last comment before we go forward. It's very important for anybody who's used to France to understand that, well, many, not all, but many of the great museums that might have collections which involve quote unquote Indigenous art are considered national, quote unquote national, either in Paris or controlled out of Paris. Not all, but most. It's very important to understand that how decentralized Canada is. And while there are very important national museums, for example, Museum of History, which has a gigantic collection of quote unquote Indigenous art, there are just as important museums, such as the Museum of Luan and the Museum of Wanda. There are about 5 or 6 museums which have gigantic, the Winnipeg Museum, have gigantic collections of Indigenous things, if you like. And we don't say, oh, that's a provincial museum, that's a national museum. We say, that's where there's a great collection. And that's the nature of decentralization. So what I'd like to do, this is going to be a conversation, and what I'd like to do is just begin, it's not speeches, but just, I think if we begin with Wanda and Luan, you work it out among yourself, just tell us a little bit about where are we in terms of restitution. I mean, how much has there been? Just a few examples, maybe. Have you got any numbers or a number of examples? And then the second, you can just do it all at once. I mean, are all the museums with the big collections in agreement, more or less in agreement, that this is the road to go down? So over to you two. I don't know which one wants to, or just do it between you.
Go ahead, Wanda.
You know me,
Fair
I'm an
enough,
artist
Wanda.
of disorder. So who wants to go first?
Do you want to go first, Luann?
No, I really want you to go first, please.
There we are, it's decided.
We're all just like, no, you first, no, you first. Okay, I'll go first. I think I want to start maybe from a historical moment, which I think is really important to the repatriation conversation. We can get to numbers and examples and stuff like that in a second. Partly because it was such a big moment in Canada when the Spirit Sings exhibition was happening. And I think, Luann, you'll have something to say about this as well, but I can only say it from my Ontario spot. and also the impact it had on a lot of artists and museum workers, Indigenous folks, and the kind of boycotting of that exhibition. And the boycotting happened for a number of different reasons. And so that led to a number of different changes. So one of the reasons was the kind of, the way it was funded through Shell. And Shell was involved in, the Lubicon were doing a land claim at the time. And they were, heavily involved in that process of excavating and extracting from our lands without our permission. And I think that is central to this conversation around repatriation. There were artists like Rebecca Belmore. She put herself inside of a glass case in Thunder Bay and exhibited herself. I think it's 671B was her exhibit number. And she presented herself as the exhibit. And it was outside in the freezing cold in winter. And it was also the time of the Olympics. It was 1988. So the flame was coming across and it was supposed to land in Thunder Bay that day. And so she wanted to put herself on display, both in collaboration with the Lubicon in honoring that situation, but also to draw attention to the issues that were happening. And so it kind of gives you that crack where it says, who are we? Do we get to define who we are? Do we get to grow? Do we get to change? Do we get to decide? Do we get to have access to our belongings, our spirits, our culture, to do with as we please, as we think, and as we want? Or do we remain an exhibit in somebody else's museum, in somebody else's history? And if the fight around that has to do with land, and it has to do with seeing us as living beings, as people with a claim today. And I think that's the scary part, right, for people, is they, that's why they wanted to think we were dying and going away, because they needed access to resources and land. And so I think it's really that 1988 Spirit Sings that kind of was a really watershed moment in raising these issues, which led to the task force, the museum task force, that was fought for by by Indigenous artists, curators, and community folk, as well as the AFN, the Assembly of First Nations. Sorry, I forget, we're talking to a bunch of people who don't know all these acronyms, and gave forth his recommendations around First Nations reclamation of their own belongings and spirits and culture. So I just wanted to flag that first and then jump over to you, Luann.
Excellent. Yes, that rolls through my mind a lot these days, because we reference that 1994 task force report quite a bit, along with the Constitution and all these other pieces that are speaking to the work we've been doing. But for me personally, a lot of this has been part of my entire growing up years. As John mentioned, I'm from Alert Bay and was present the day that the Utmista Cultural Center opened. And this was to bring back the treasures that were confiscated from my family, our families, all of our families, while we were carrying out our traditional ceremonies, what everyone calls the potlatch. And so bringing that day, seeing all of our old people remembering what happened. They were there, their parents were thrown in jail for dancing, for making speeches, for just doing what we normally do in our ceremonies, which we do not call religious ceremonies. These are our spiritual and cultural ceremonies, and they're very much a part of our governance structure. So standing there that day, listening to our old people and watching them in tears of joy to see our great treasures come home and to be reunited and know that our future generations would get to continue in all of our traditions. And so that really prompted me in the work I'm doing now from an artistic perspective, mostly, but also from a governance perspective. Taking a look at how we understand what's in the museums, looking at the terminology, looking at just the very way we think about how these things have come to be in these collections. I don't even like the word collections, but really rethinking all of that, looking at how repatriation, even though the terminology hasn't been really used that way until recent times, when we were talking about bringing our treasures home, along with other nations along the coast who had things confiscated during the potlatch ban, we had to put it under the heading with the federal government of reclaiming or specific claims, or under a smaller umbrella, underneath a larger umbrella of land claims. So it got really complex and complicated just to avoid acknowledging who we are and the fact that we're still here, we're living cultures, and that these are our belongings. So just going through even the last 5 decades, the last 50 to 60 years, and the trajectory that people, all of our tribes took and approached all of this in different ways. And so for my community, it's been about just getting our treasures home so we can put them back into the families who hold these rights in the first place and whose treasures have been held captive, as many of our families say, in these strange, dark places and not expressing who we are as a people. So I think that, yeah, we can talk numbers later. I have some numbers, but they don't really tell the story, I think, of what we're really doing.
I think you're right and I'm wrong as usual. So
I'm happy that you mentioned the governance, because I think that that's a really important aspect of the return, is also this kind of political return to kind of rejuvenating our own governance practices. And a really important one was the Six Nations Confederacy wampum belts that were returned 1991. That was another one that was pretty early. And that's a case where the Canadian government had gone into the Longhouse and had kind of stolen the belts and declared, you know, the Longhouse was no longer the government in power, and that they had to do the Indian Act band system, which is a chief and council election system, which is not the traditional governance of the Six Nations. And it's amazing the power of and persistence of our people to continue to practice and to do their own governance system, because that Longhouse is still strong today.
Yes.
So why don't we go to Saskia, and you can say something. You've heard what's now been said, and maybe you can do some kind of introduction of the same sort, and then we'll go back to it. But I do want to say that this idea that Wanda just put out there, that the rejuvenation of another idea of governance, because remember, we're speaking to a lot of people who don't live in Canada and aren't Canadians and haven't heard this argument put this way, that this idea that there are ideas of governance which do not come out of the Western tradition, which owe nothing to the Western tradition, which their roots are in the peoples whose system it is and whose place it is. And that idea of the return of those ideas of governance, where that will lead in 10 years, I don't think any of us know, but the idea that that's returning and becoming accepted as an idea of legitimacy, at the moment sort of parallel, I mean, there's a battle going on, is really, really important and interesting, and it relates to museums and art. So Saskia, what would you like to throw in at the beginning?
First, thank you for inviting. And I would like maybe, I think...
a little louder, maybe, a little louder.
Land acknowledgement is very, I think it's very important, and we should all do that. And if I can, I would like to do that for where I am now.
Great.
Just a few, because I am in Dakar, but I am in the land of the Lebu people, and the Lebu people were the first inhabitants of the peninsula of the Cap Vert. And I am in the very old village of Wakam. There's a king of Wakam, and 100 meters from the very ancient and traditional fisherman port, and very connected to sea, the deities of the sea. So I would just say that because I think I would do that now, and I think we should do that. And thank you for that. And in Wolof, the language of the Lebu, we say "Ñoo far," on est ensemble. We are together, even if we are a part of the world. I think we French have a lot of things to learn from you, from Canada, from indigenous people, from repatriation. Just to introduce what happened in France, 1 month ago, there's been a law. We returned 26 artifacts to the Republic of Benin and 1 to Senegal. And this happened after years or maybe decades, or I should say centuries of controversies about and claims for repatriation from African countries, but especially for 2 years since the president of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, claimed for restitution. And after a report, which was in 1918, I think. I'm sorry for my English, it's a problem with the date.
English is just fine.
And so this law is very new for the French people, and what you have to know that all the artifacts, things, I would prefer to say things, but we could speak about that later, or works or pieces of works, when they enter in the public collection, whether it's national or it's a town museum or any public collection, can't quit. So it's the principle of inalienability. So this law just broke this inalienability for these 27 artifacts. They don't own to the public collection anymore. And this law was happened after very big controversy in France for 2 years. Maybe I could say more about these artifacts, but the thing I can say is that what is interesting that this object or this scene has always already traveled in Africa, actually. Some of them were in Benin in 2007. The sword was already in Senegal. So it's kind of just acting something which was on the way for years, but acting in the law. So for the French context, it's something very new. But regarding to what happened in Canada, we are on the way, what I should say. So just to say that for African claim for repatriation are very ancient, since the loot of Benin City, not the Benin Republic, Benin City is in Nigeria at the end of the 19th, maybe it's something you know more, but it has been the claim in the 60s during the African festival. I had an interview with a very old friend, Professor Olabi, who claimed for the return in 1966, and he went in jail in Dakar, as he was vice president of the Fédération des étudiants africains en France. And in 1969, in a festival in Alger that you heard about, it was part of the official claim, the return, the repatriation of the cultural properties. It was, so it's something very ancient, but until 2 years ago, the French have always said that it's not possible because it's part of the public collection. It's part of the nation state. And it's a way of appropriating that you can't broke, except for human remains. We could speak maybe later on what means this Occidental dichotomy about on human remains, because it's a bit complicated.
Could I ask just a little question? So when you use the word inaliénabilité, that means that it is first and foremost the property of the state, is one with the state. That's what that means in this case?
The state, the nation state, the people,
the nation state, yeah.
Public collection.
Just so people who don't speak French understand that what it takes the quote unquote objects into the undeniable ownership of the nation state, which is why it can't, but inside that argument, it can't be taken out. You have to leave the argument for them to come out. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you have to make a law each time you want to take off something.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, I could say many things. It's just
all right. But let's sort of go back now. So tell me, is this the moment to just make people who don't know anything, of whom there hopefully will be many, because everybody's learning, to just give them a little bit of an idea of where things, I think that Saskia has told us a little bit about where things stand in terms of France and African nations. What about in Canada? Can you just give us a little sense of where things now stand? Sure. Who'd like to go first? Wanda, you go first.
Well, it's just like, and my throat's dry for some reason, but she said human remains, and so it triggered something for me. That says a lot about where we are, because I think with this stuff, it's like 10 steps forward, 10 steps back. It's like we're moving, but we're not moving at the same time. So there is change, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, and it needs to be Indigenous led, and that's the part that hasn't happened yet enough. So I'm thinking of Demastuit, who is a Beothuk woman who, from the east coast of Canada, First Nation that kind of had European interaction and had to deal with early colonialism, was captured, her and her husband were captured, partially as a program of learning about the Beothuk. So it's like, we want to learn about you, so we're going to steal you from your home and like, bring you forward. Anyway, people are so dumb, really, in their thinking. Anyway, so it's not a happy story, but in the process of capturing her, her husband gets shot, and then 6 days later, her newborn baby dies, and she dies a year later of tuberculosis, and she becomes kind of this curiosity item for an anthropologist, for an archaeologist, for that kind of field that we are talking about that gave birth to these public collections. So her remains, when she died, she was buried next to her husband and her daughter, or her child. I can't remember if it's a son or a daughter, and it really doesn't matter in our age of non-binary gender. She eventually gets dug up by a Scottish guy and taken to the Scottish Ethnology Museum and put there. She was just returned actually in 2020. And this is the sticky part, right? It's like they want to even when you have repatriation, they don't want to decide things based on Indigenous ideas of what should be done, right? So it gets returned to another museum, which is the Canadian Museum of History. Then there's more fighting that happens to get it returned to Newfoundland, where her, you know, in Labrador, where her body, where the people who've been fighting to bring her home want to bury her again, right? So now it's like, again, it's transferred from one museum to another museum. And so it's like, we want to often bury things or let them go back to the ground, or, you know, protect things. And we don't have there isn't always a distinction between a human remain and an object, because our objects also have spirit and are also living things. And this is where we have a real conflict. And I wanted to ask Luann, actually, in relation to this, these kinds of structures that we have to build to get things back. So you missed it as a beautiful example, but at the same time, it was kind of a requirement, right? You have to have a proper museum. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little.
And,
Sure.
and Luann, you know, you have this very interesting context, which you've mentioned, which is the return of the potlatch dancing masks and pieces, which were, it was 1921 that the police stepped in and seized everything and humiliated everybody. And
That's right.
and I think it'd be interesting exactly to open that question of, these are not objects. These are spiritual. These have meaning. These are related to governance. So I think that would be great. And I'm sure Saskia would have something to add on that front.
Yeah. Yeah, I really share that idea, because the things of what kingdom of Abomey who are going back, they are seeing work of art, but for the people of Abomey, and especially the women called the Dadasi, which are, because it's only women who can incarn the gods, the ancient kings can only go into women. And so this piece of art are kings, and so they are living, and so people are waiting for them to feed them, to take care of them. The question of human remains is not very, has no sense, but it has a sense regarding to the law and what happened in 2008, because the museum of a town wanted to give back tête Maori. It was a head of Maori people, and they want to give it back at remains people, but it was forbidden because it was considered as cultural properties. So it was a big debate. I mean, so the problem was not, okay, to say, okay, you think this is an object, but it's not an object for the people. The thing was, this is even the, I don't know the name in English, the crâne.
The head.
The head.
People, it's called scale, cannot be considered because they were decorated. So it's two different worlds. But inside, in the museum, even in France and everybody, there's people who understand that. And for the objects who are going back to Benin, it's very important to take into account this question of the woman who has to feed and to speech, to its language to the ancient kings, because all of them are Vodou. Even if you don't know anything about Vodou, you would think that it's only regalias of the king of Abomey, but they are Vodou things. And so the French, it's not only repatriation, it's also cultural cooperation. So they would build a new museum in Abomey. It's exactly what you said, Wanda. So, okay, you can have your thing, but in the museum with certain criteria. So the thing is, I think the big stake is this museum configured or thought to be able to let the people touch, feed, speak to the gods. And because the kings, when he's gone, he's not gone actually, and the woman, the Dadasi, has to speak to feed him and to go into trance.
So that's perfect, I think, as an introduction and to that idea. And why don't we now go to Luann to see what she will bring to that?
Yes, very, very much along the same lines, that these are these things that are called art are actually expressions of our history. They're pieces that all fit together to tell our history. And these pieces of history belong to individuals, to families, these ideas around communal and shared ownership that aren't addressed by current law. So it's very complex, but it's not impossible to understand if we just stop thinking of things always in this colonial context. So, so a couple of things on the what you were mentioning, Wanda, around this requirement early on. When the UMESTA opened in Alert Bay, this was in 1980-81, and it had already been 20 years of negotiating with the federal government for the return of our treasures. And so entire lifetimes have gone into just landing at that moment in time. And since then, at least in the last couple of years since I've been with the Royal BC Museum, there's been a lot of internal discussions around this. Who got to decide that this requirement would be slammed on the table and required of these sovereign people to get their own belongings back? And somewhere a little bit before I arrived at the Royal BC Museum, my predecessor, Lucy Bell from Haida Gwaii, who had been working on repatriation with her own community for many years, started to have that conversation. And there was actually nothing from the Royal BC Museum and from the province of BC's perspective that could actually legally require a community to build a museum. So this was, in fact, the biggest question, the most frequently asked question that I received in 2018 onwards when I started as the repatriation specialist. The first thing communities would phone up and ask is, do we have to build a museum because we don't have money, we don't have a space, we don't have the means to do that, just to get our treasures back? And so I would let people know that, no, that was not a requirement. It's none of our business what communities do once their things are returned. They belong to them. What we wanted to do was to very much emphasize that the Royal BC Museum's position is that whatever we can do to help. If a community wants to create a space in their community, what my job early on was to network with people I've met over the years, different departments with funding, and assist the community and support them in whatever it is they wanted to do. So one example I'll give is one of the communities that had under a treaty, the BC treaty process, completed the treaty, negotiated which items from the collection were going to be returned. And the community recognized that they wanted these pieces because there was only one example of these particular masks and rattles, etc. They knew who they belonged to, but the families that really owned them wanted all of the community, and in particular, the artists, to see these works and have access to these works on a regular basis so that they could learn from these ancient pieces and bring them back into everyday practice. So what this community did was asked us to help with the fabrication of a custom set of cabinets with the UV protection and climate control, all those things that are part of our museum practices. Our conservation lab and folks from inside the museum help them understand the best ways, the best practices, and how to get that done. And we enabled through a grant, a repatriation grant program that we started back in 2018, provided the funding to create those cabinets. And so when the cabinets were created, we arranged for these pieces to go back to the community, and now they are in place in these very open spaces for the community. Now the artists have the ability to recreate or create replicas of the existing piece, because it turns out on that communal shared ownership idea that it's probably more like 5 or 10 families have the rights and the traditional governance knowledge to be able to wear that particular mask. So the artists from each respective family can now create those pieces to return to their family. And we don't, as the museum or the province of BC, that's when it becomes even more so none of our business. But the community gets to continue and encouraging the young people to practice the culture by learning from these older pieces. And I'll just say one thing on the matter of ancestral remains, and we call them ancestral remains instead of human remains. One of the big priorities of repatriation from this particular museum has been the return of the ancestral remains. And the grant program that we ran in 2018-19 was really focused on making sure ancestral remains were returned as a priority. And again, none of our business how the community went about doing that. It was our business to support them in whatever they wanted to do. So some communities did full reburials. Some of the funding we were able to provide created the new burial boxes. Some of them created burial cairns where the ashes of those who were cremated were all placed and then sealed so they couldn't be stolen again. And with the remaining ancestral remains that are still in the museum, we're in full negotiation with these communities to figure out what each of them would like to do to ensure that this doesn't happen again in their communities, and to bring back some of the traditions around how burials are done, because we weren't in the habit of doing reburials, we just did burials.
Can I ask a question? While this negotiation, which seems endless, is going on, but it's advancing, what kind of arrangements are there in museums in Canada for, in the meantime, for the proper people, if it's elders or spiritual leaders, to have some kind of, to have access to these objects of all sorts, and to have some say in, to do smudges, and to have some say in whether they are shown or not, and in what conditions they're shown. And just something about that would be interesting.
Yeah, we're very much in the middle of that process right now. The Royal BC Museum is undergoing a big physical change. Our buildings will be taken down and rebuilt again. But as part of that process, we've also set up over the last year discussions with communities. And of course, we have 34 different large cultural groups just in BC alone, 34 to 35 languages, which means 35 different cultures, with everyone having different protocols. So part of what we've done is all the way along, we've made it possible for communities to come in and visit the collections, visit the items that belong to them. Elders have come in, often with young people from the community who are learning the language. So the elders can talk about the pieces in English and in their language. They're being recorded by the community. So under COVID, we've had to really narrow down how many people can come, but we can still arrange it. And what we're doing right now is we're setting up to do 360 video recordings of different items, as long as the community says those ones are okay to be videotaped. There are sacred and secret items that we would never videotape unless they asked us to. So for people who can't travel into Victoria right now to see these things, we're arranging to videotape, send the video so that the elders can still offer whatever advice or information they can. And then we continue our negotiations for the time of their return and anything that needs to be done in preparation. And then the last thing I'll say about this is in preparation for our new buildings, before we even start packing anything, we're consulting with communities to ask, who should be handling these items? There are items that should not be handled by either men or women. You know, there are very specific rules in each community. How should they be rewrapped? Already the ancestral remains were taken out by Lucy Bell, taken out of the bubble plastic wrap that they were in for decades and properly wrapped. And we did a feeding ceremony to offer food to the ancestors to let them know that they were going to return home soon. And so the same kind of work is being done in discussions with communities to say, how should these be handled? How should they be stored? And tell us now what items should just not be seen by anybody. So we can do that at the outset, as well as clarifying what the correct names of the people are. Everything in the system and in many museums is, the naming convention is based on ethnology. And there's such broad naming conventions that they don't actually accurately reflect who the people are. So we're also doing that change to make sure that we're talking to the correct people.
So a quick,
I always think of
can I just want to ask you, I think, so very quickly. So we know that, for example, the Museum of History in Ottawa for a long time, elders or spiritual leaders have access, I think 24 hours a day or something, and they do smudges, and they have a power over exactly what Luann's been describing. And so some things are shown in darkened rooms, some things are shown with slats over the windows you have to peek in. And I just wondered if you had something to say that give people who don't know about this a sense of, is that widespread? Is that where it's going in as the kind of interim phase?
Yeah, there's very much
maybe let Wanda do.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh no.
Go ahead,
This is the only job I got, right? Move it around.
Thank you.
Sorry. I've been thinking about it is more widespread in the sense that it is taking place in most of like the ROM, the Glenbow, the CMH, Canadian Museum of History. Those are the museums that have majority of these collections. When you move over into the fine arts space, Indigenous artists have been fighting so hard to get in there, and those museums have really been really negative towards historical works, you know, and so it's a totally different conversation on that side, where artists have been fighting to have the historical things seen as art, which I'm not actually totally in agreement with, and I have taken a different tack in my career, but I understand that impulse, right, to want to put everything on par with each other. I just feel like we talked about earlier, the word art is not the right word to join these things together. And also, I think I have a policy which will be written eventually, but we have a do not buy anything sacred, no purchasing of anything that should belong to communities. But there's this other thing happening, which I think you're referring to too, where folks come in and they, you know, they're kind of called custodial arrangements. So moving away from this notion of ownership to being co-custodians. So basically the community, it's really the community's belonging. It's being taken care of at the museum, and then the way you take care of it is decided together in a way. And so, you know, we're trying to think that through even in terms of Inuit art, like how do we think of as us holding something, caring for something that actually truly belongs to the community. And it goes against all kind of museumology thinking, because it's all about, you know, we own this. And so this is where we're pushing also the museum in that direction. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think about, as Luann was talking and as Saskia was talking, I can't help but think of the body, right? Like my body, when I walk into a museum and I can feel when there's human remains in there, when there's ancestral remains in there, I can feel when, you know, a spirit is suffocating under glass, you can feel it, like your heart breaks. And I've been with other folks older than me who've been living with this way longer than I have, who just, you know, they cry because it is that kind of thing, you know. It's not as simple as just legal changes and stuff. This is a heartbreak. It's an injustice. And I was thinking about the Canadian Museum of History when Robert Houle was the first curator there of Indigenous art. At the time they called it Indian art. And he quit in 1980 because he had been down in the vaults and where most of the collections are held in the dark in storage. And he saw that there had been a medicine bundle that had been entrusted to the museum because we were going through colonization. So massive amounts of people were dying from smallpox, from all kinds of diseases. People were worried, right? Wanted to save these things for future generations. So they did go to some, in very small cases, most of them were stolen. I'm just saying in very small cases, and this was one, the owner of this medicine bundle, the caretaker, took it to the museum and said, can you hold on to this? But it, you know, doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the future generations when they are ready to come for it. But there was a stipulation that you were never to open it, never open it. And he had been down there and it broke his heart because he saw them doing little chemical tests, as conservators can do, on this, you know, and it's that
they'd taken
that
it over.
really, it opened a big national conversation because he did a big, huge quit over it, you know, and it opened this kind of conversation about this. And from that point forward, it has moved quite quickly towards allowing people in to care for things properly and feed them and do that.
Yeah, I know it's still going on a lot in the States, where various people have told me about famous bundles that were bundles of very important people, and that from museological, quotes unquote, point of view, they feel obliged to open it and take it apart, and they say, we put leather over here, bones go over here, you know? And so they're treating them as separate objects and destroying, of course, they're objectivizing them and destroying the whole idea that there is spiritual. So let's do this. So we have a few questions and answers. Saskia, do you want to say something? And I'd like us to kind of, as we're talking to people, to talk about how do you imagine the idea of the museum becoming something else, if it ever does? Because it would be inevitable as we move more and more towards the idea that these are not Renaissance objects. These are, in a way, joining back into the older, the Greek idea that objects are alive and have spiritual force, which was driven out of them from the Renaissance on. And in a way, what's happening now with these objects is we're going back into the idea, thanks to indigenous people, that these are not museological objects, just of beauty. They are spiritual and of great meaning. And that then throws into question the definition of museology and the museum. So Saskia, I mean, throw something in here and then we'll go to question and answers and finish around that idea.
But actually, I think that a lot of collectioners and maybe people working in the museum, they don't have only this kind of Occidental rationality. They also see that it is alive and there's something, it's only that they want it for them. I mean, there's something, I don't think that it's only because it's called fish who don't see and don't feel anything. I think especially the collectioners, the art, you know, all the traffic of art. I don't think that people just do that for business. Actually, if it was only for business, maybe it would be simple. I think it's a question also of spoliation or taking the spirit of the other. The Occidentals are not the first to do that, but you know, I don't think maybe because I grew up in a village, in a place where you have sorceries but I don't think that's only a question of rationality. I think that it's a speech. So to think about the museum of tomorrow is to think about how you do something together. In Benin, there's something very important you say all the time, people say all the time, is we cannot forgive, but we can forget. So as we cannot forgive you, we will forget. But if you can't forget, then you can forgive. And when something is going back all the time, like this kind of, you know, colonial heritage and discussion, and you have to build something else. And I think maybe it's not only in rational exchange that something would happen in the new museum, but that everybody accepts that you have to give back the thing to the people. And maybe you can do like it has been done in the kingdom of Abomey, but everywhere. If you want the spirit, if you want to have something of the spirit of the people, you can invite the people. You can invite them to make art. I mean, it's something which is different, that you take the object of somebody else and you, in the kingdom of Abomey, the kings were installing the people, the artists. No, it was because they were not interested in the object or the thing of the other kingdom. But when they would appreciate one, they would think it's a good God. They would take the artist or the family of this family who make this kind of art, and they would give him a land to settle in his place because he's for him to be here, he's part of the strength of the nation. And maybe if we have another relation to the diaspora with the museum in France and with the people in the place, if we think of museum as a place to meet and not as a place to keep, maybe things would be different. But I think you are already, I mean, you are an example of what can be done. But the thing is that the French state doesn't recognize indigenous people. I mean, there's no autochthonous in France. I mean, there's one people, the French nation. And so it's the same thing with the people who claim for repatriation. It's only a state who can claim for repatriation. So it's only people, nation from certain states who can claim. Because if in the country there's people on war or on conflict, the state won't ask for this object of the people that not his part. I'm sorry for my English, which is terrible. I think something we have to learn about what's happening now is also, maybe it's gendered, but this kind of thing that, you know, you have this Occident, we are rational and everything. And I think it's very different. If you look, I mean, I think somebody should do what you've done for Canada, John, about France. I mean, maybe it's more difficult, but regarding to the role of the witch, for example, there were thousands of kills for years. It was a huge killing of the woman for years and for centuries. And maybe there's something, and what maybe all this kind of conversation can help. I mean, sorry.
No, that's very, very interesting. We have somebody who's made a comment saying that we're asking or saying that we're saying that these quote unquote art objects are actually documents, representational artifacts. I would have, and I'll throw it over to you, but I would have thought what we're actually saying, or what you're actually saying, is that we have to move away from the anthropological approach. Because once you go down the road of the anthropological approach, you take the bundle apart and you examine the bones and you look at a rock and say, well, that's an interesting rock. When did they carve it? As opposed to, what is the meaning of this and what is the spirit of this? So just if Luan and, well, any one of the three of you or all of you have something to say about that idea of moving away from the anthropological, without forgetting that, you know, it's interesting to know some things. Anyone who'd like to go first? Okay, Luan.
I'll just show you in the background here, I've got two of my dance capes, one from my mother's side of the family and one from my father's side of the family. I don't consider them artifacts. I don't consider them things to be studied by other people who don't know anything about my culture, you know, unless they are present during ceremony and want to learn. I think it doesn't do anything interesting or bring us closer if we're just studying from a distance. I think it's hugely important that if people really want to know about, you know, this, my mother's side, and that, my father's side, come to my ceremony. Allow me to invite you to come and be present with our people and understand that these aren't representations of anything but our history. And these are my rights, but they also spell out my obligations and my responsibilities within my culture. So when I wear these things, I'm declaring to people that I am now speaking under the house of my mother or my father, and that my responsibility and obligations flow from there, and that all my intentions come from there. And so this idea of these treasures being put on a table and regarded as so separate from us confuses me. I try to understand from an anthropological, ethnology, and even linguistics, this taking apart of words with an entirely other language unto itself. It confuses us because we're not getting back to the essence of it. This is our culture, it's who we are, dictates where we come from and where we're going. But for me, the most important thing is not just what my rights are, but what my responsibilities are under these crests.
Anybody else? So I think that's great. I mean, you summarized it very beautifully. Oh, sorry, Saskia, quickly, yeah.
No, it's just to say that I think, I don't know what, I mean, you've got different kind of cultural, social anthropology, but I think it would be what we do with it. I mean, I don't feel like I have to do something. And I think as a woman, you see something else, you have other connection, you go into the house differently. I'm sorry to give a gender, but I think something, it's also a different way to study the thing, and it's all together that we can build acknowledgement, and I don't think you have to be away, or I don't think so. So I don't want to. I say many things against the museum, and then against my own discipline, but but I think yeah, we have to open the way, open the path, I would say, in the fa, the divination, jogbe. That's mean how you do sacrifice. It's not the destiny which is already written. Okay, you do the divination, and if it's not jogbe, if the path is not open, you make a sacrifice to open the path. That means you're not like Oedipe. We can battle, but at the end he kills his father. That means that you can change the future. And it's very important for everybody, but especially for the women in Benin now, who are waiting for the kings, the ancestors remains, as I like this term, I will use it, to come back, because they are the kings, and they're all usually, they're often forgotten.
I see that Katya, I think it is, has asked a second question, which, questioner is always right, up to a point, that what she meant by documents was that if you restrict access to the information in the documents, people can't use that information. And, I know that part of the answer is, for 150 years, people took that information, people like me took that information and used it for our purposes. And that the response has been, this is actually sometimes sacred information, completely private information, and we will decide what will be done with this information. If we want to make it public to you, we will decide that. You will not decide that. And so I've tried to summarize it, but tell me if I've got it right or wrong.
There's another aspect of that, I think that's important, or maybe two. One being that because of colonization, there are breakages in the lineages and in the passing down of information, not always, but there are some. And so as the information has been cataloged and written about by people other than those who it belongs to, that information comes back to our kids. You know what I mean? And then there is a lot of unlearning that needs to happen even within our own bodies and our own minds and our own thing to get away from that. I think about Franz Boas, right? And how much his writing is like kind of like swallowed any kind of way you can think about, S forms and ovoids and things like this, and what things mean. This is the problem, is that it can suffocate the meaning and life of our culture by being read from elsewhere and outside. And it could be read wrong, and then our own people have to struggle with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and just for those who don't know, Boas was a very important figure, American, right?
Yeah.
Came to the West.
Did America exist then?
Yeah. Came into the West to BC, I guess. What about 1890s? Or am I wrong? Just remind, because a lot of people don't know.
A little earlier, too.
Just tell people quickly.
Yeah, the late 1800s.
Yeah.
He spent a lot of time in our territory at Fort Rupert, working very closely with George Hunt, documenting the governance systems, the social systems, all of these things of the Kwakwaka'wakw people, which he at the time named Kwakiutl, which was one of 24 villages, and really sort of set a precedent on his precedent on how things should be documented and told. And many of those things have actually confused like what you're saying, Wanda, our younger generations, because of the way he's written it. It's not written from our lens, so the things aren't understood the way and the context has been skewed.
And there's also,
but it's still valuable facts in there.
Yeah, totally. And that's the thing, right? There's still valuable stuff in anthropology and ethnography. And some of these, there's a lot of interviews been done with elders, right, that we wouldn't have. Like there's, it's not it's not an either or kind of situation. It is about context and the effect of its use, the effect of the writing. And unfortunately, we have this whole history of salvage ethnography where, just because they were thinking we were dying, they had to like record everything. And that recording becomes the way it's said and done today. And that's like the problem.
I think one of the really interesting things that was brought up by Wanda early on was the fight to get today's artists in. And I think you said it, or it's implied in it, that those artists are both who they are today. So in a sense, in the Western sense of the artist, but they're also the inheritors of this endless line into what I would call active memory, which you might not like the term, but anyway. And so I think some words about...
It's okay, John. I kind of like the term.
Oh, do you? Thank God, thank God. I'm alive. I think it's a very interesting thing that a lot of non-Indigenous artists are noticing in Canada and thinking about today. And it's a very complicated thing because it's not what they've been taught at art school in the past. And so they're having to rethink themselves from a non-Indigenous point of view. So that's really interesting. So I think just if you and anybody else wants to say a few words about, it's almost like not simply a redefining of what an artist is, it's certainly moving away from art for art's sake, or that the genius of the artist is simply that one person, and back to a more, and I say back in the sense that memory is active, back to a much more eternal sense that the artist is part of something which exists already, and that we're all building out from that in some way. And Malraux, I mean, interesting enough, Malraux would have agreed with everything that's being said here, I think, and he's not given credit by more technically museological people for that. But anyway, so what would you have to say about, the Indigenous artists today, and what kind of pattern are they setting for themselves and their communities and their nations, but also maybe for other artists?
I think I would resist, because I always do.
I know.
Sweeping statements on the artist today, but I can say maybe something where to throw in another wrench in what we're talking about.
Good.
In terms of the fact that there are a few generations now of artists who've gone to art school. So, starting in 1950s with Alex Janvier, right? And so they have been engaging the entire Western tradition of art making right up to contemporary right now. And they are engaged in those discourses, engaged in that kind of making, asking themselves questions that come out of that history. And I think that there are also another group of artists that are deeply engaged in traditions that are ancient and wanting to bring them forward and maintain them and keep them going. And there's another group who's wants to mess with those traditions, keeping them alive through transforming them into a kind of contemporary art space, right? So there's so many different streams of artists that we have to think about. And I think that when I'm sitting at the AGO, I think, what is this space? What can it do the best currently and how it's constructed? And I'm like, well, there's a whole slew of contemporary living Indigenous artists that haven't had, their space, and haven't had the ability to have big shows and do their work. And this is what they want to do. Not every artist wants to represent their culture. Not every artist wants to, go that route. And I think that if we are to consider ourselves post-colonial, which is impossible because colonization is still going on, but if we want to think towards the future, then we have to make space for all of that, right? Like we have to think that there are artists out there that want to do their work in the Western sense.
Yeah.
They want to have shows and they want to tour and they want to do all that. And I think that I'm interested in the way, of course, that that they're bringing different things to the table in that, of course, because we can't separate ourselves from our culture. And like, what would I do? Cut off this finger? Would I scrape the skin off? Like, how could I ever separate all these things out from each other, right? It's impossible. So it's there whether we are cognizant of it or not. So I just think that there's, you know, I want to make room for living artists. I want to make room for people who are making things today. And that's really, really important to me. And it's really important to challenge audiences, because I think that's the work that challenges them the most, because it's the least desired. They don't want work that's kind of in their face. They don't want to be thinking about contemporary Indigenous people as having land claims, as having, you know, it creates anxiety about your own identity and your own place and your own history and all those kinds of things. So I think, yeah. And I also want to find a way for us, all these communities, to coexist and work together and belong together. And to me, that's a new museum that hasn't been thought of yet, or a new, not even, it wouldn't even be a museum, I think.
And I just throw in, you'd already thrown in some earlier names. Belcourt, help me.
Oh, the artist name?
Yeah.
Belmore. One I mentioned
But
earliest.
and then, you know, in those three categories, I mean, Bill Reid belongs, who's, you know, famous and has had very important objects and things which have influenced the way people think and are in museums, and who's one sort of version of that. And of course, Kent Monkman today, with laced with irony and using, you know, 19th century methodologies, European methodologies, is another version, and there are many, many other versions, as you said. Does anybody else want to put something in about this idea of, well, Luann, you're an artist, so what would you say?
I think it's fun because I went to art school too, but I didn't go to art school to hone my craft in what I had already learned in my traditions. I went there to find out what makes white people think when it comes to art. Why do they think that way? And I was really fascinated. And I've had this exhibit in the works for years called Watching You, Watching Me. And I think it's morbidly fascinating sometimes, frustrating as all get up. But I think that what I've been advocating for years from someone who was taught in our traditions, but also went to art school, was there's a lot of discussions our artists and our arts communities and our cultural communities need to have amongst ourselves. Wanda talked a little bit about it with, you know, the things that kept our systems of producing art, creating these sacred things, that was broken apart as well. As much as, you know, everything is so interconnected that with the potlatch ban came the destruction of our own arts societies, our own secret societies, and we have not rebuilt those yet. And so we still need to work on that. And what it's been is this knee-jerk reaction to the Western world ever since. My grandmother experienced it in the 40s in Vancouver. Everything she created, you know, was this response to this tourist market, and the only way that she could make a living, and still being lowballed on the prices in her involvement in the commercial market. But I think that what's really important for our generation is to take the steps to have these discussions again and bring back some of our own philosophies and thinking. I'm one of those people that straddles several opinions on this. I'm very much interested in participating in a contemporary market, but there are things that I produce on my own in my quiet time that only go to our ceremonies. They don't ever see the light of day outside of our ceremonies. That's my obligation again, my responsibility. But the freedom that I have as a contemporary artist, keeping anything that's sacred out of my general practice, there's still so much more. And there's so much wisdom and knowledge that I want to explore, connections with science, connections with mathematics, around how our art is formed and the thinking behind it. I think it's pure genius, but we need those discussions amongst our artists first. Bring that together. And I think that one of the things that would really be helpful is if our governments would assist us in making sure that learning, the kinds of learning for the public can happen, that these, just because of that, what was it called? The I always think of it smash and grab archaeology, but you call it salvage archaeology.
Sorry, say that again.
I get smash and grab in my head when I hear salvage archaeology. This idea that these dying cultures did in fact die, and therefore all of the Western rules around 50 years after the death of an artist, their work becomes part of the public realm. No, that's not how it works in our culture. And but that the prevailing laws allow for that, or that people just think if you put, even I've had this happen to me as recently as 2 weeks ago, I share a design that I've created on Facebook, and somebody took it and made a tattoo. They tattooed my design to their body without even asking me. So lots more discussion to go on that, but you know, some of the laws that we're currently under that prevent us from stopping that, those need to be changed as well.
Saskia, come back into the conversation and give us where you are in terms of what we've been talking about the artist and the memory and the freedom of the artist or the attachment of the artist.
In 3 minutes.
Yeah. 2 minutes, okay.
Two actually.
2 minutes, 1 minute. I think it's very important that the people who are involved in traditional religion and can also be artists, but that they are not selected only on the art market criteria, and can be free to do what the stuff. I mean, for traditional, like Luan said, and sometimes it's terrible because it's the one who let his traditional stuff to go into the market who will win, and it's very difficult. And it's I have precise example in Benin that I would not speak about now, but I think it's very important because now in Benin the tradition is very alive and vibrant, but there's a kind of still a war from the monotheism against the tradition. So now, I mean, the Vodou tradition and philosophy. So now the question is now. It's not in the 90s, it's now. And tourism, and especially of tourism, and the way of merchandising the Vodou is maybe can bring some money, but if it's done to kill the spirit, it's a problem. So I think we have to, to give strength to the people, and especially the women, because it's her who has the knowledge, the genealogy, the mamlan, the oriki, the story of the people. It's the old aunts, and usually they don't speak French, so they know the art, the way of doing things, and they know the stories. So it's now or never. And so the contemporary art is very important to recreate, to reinvent, but you have to take care for the balance, because it's not like ground zero and then because the things are live now, but they could change and disappear very quickly because of the tourist and art market connected to the repatriation. So it's big deal.
So thank you so much. This has really been wonderful. And if I'm allowed, I'll just add a tiny story at the end, which is something 22 years ago, my wife and I, Adrian, were in Haida Gwaii, the archipelago of the Haida people. And we were up in Old Masset in the studio of one of the famous families of, we would say, an artist, but generations of artists. And I'm not going to go into the details of names and who at this point. And looking at this wonderful work that was going on. And there was a young man who was carving his first mask. And it was part of the kind of studio, the family, whatever. And I loved what he was doing. And I said to him, is there any chance that you might do a mask for Adrian? And I was thinking of, he's a young artist, this would be a great, thing. It'd be the first thing he'd sold, and wouldn't that be kind of fun? And I love what he's doing. So I was thinking it really as a kind of Western guy, right? Not in a demeaning way, but And he said, sure, I'd love to do that. And I said, well, can I pay you now? And then we just don't have to talk about this again. He said, look, you know, I will do this in my time, but of course you can't have it in any way, shape or form until it has been properly danced in a ceremony, because otherwise it will not be inhabited. It will only be, you know, like a tourist object or something. It'll be one-sided, if you like. And so about 5 years later, we went back on, at that point, an official trip, and it was done by then. And we went to a room, and the official dancers or spiritual leaders were there. And there was this amazing dance with you know, with kind of a cloth or held up, etc. And then slowly through the cloth, the young man came wearing the mask. And the full ritual and protocols of the mask were carried out. And then it was handed to Adrian at the end of it all. And then somebody else came up to me as we were out in the street and said, this is how much you owe me, you know. So, which was quite right, you know. But I thought it was, you know, I have a little list of things since about 1980 of moments where I realize I'm a fool and something happens and I make a little step forward. And that was one of those wonderful, wonderful moments for me. So if I'm allowed to put that in. I think we're at the end of time, if everybody's okay with that. And I just want to say thank you. I think a lot of things were said.
John?
Really interesting things. So thank you.
John, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to ask you a last question.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, this is the theme of Night of Ideas. So could you perhaps give us an answer on what means the word closer for you? So, qu'est-ce que le mot proche en français, closer in English, means for you? Just a short answer.
Me or everybody?
Everybody.
Everybody. Good. So in other words, in the theme is comment être proche, how to be close to people. And I don't know if there's another word for it in English, frankly, but anyway, like a one sentence, very like snappy answer, because this is their theme, and they just, what does it mean to be proche? I know, as you get closer to the end, it gets shorter, right?
I'll go first, because I can be short. I think about the word closer in relation to the topic we just had, and that's that what has infected and allowed this injustice to continue is the lack of closeness and the lack of relationality. So the closer we come together, the more we work with communities, with people, bringing everyone inside and the inside going out, you know, I think that we will build something much, much better. And we have to be in relation to each other. We can't allow segregation to continue.
Can I add to this? You know, I've always been struck by the idea that the great circle, being invited into the circle, is one of the ways of building community differently. So I'll go to Luann next, and then we'll end with the furthest away.
Okay. So we have two words in our language of Kwakwala. The first one is mayakhala, and it's the idea that of the utmost respect that one can show to another person and that we show to one another. So mayakhala means bringing us closer together. The second word is namdlashla. We are all one. And so putting together mayakhala and namdlashla, understanding one another. The only way we're all going to get through this human condition is if we understand one another and respect one another. Thank you. Hela Kasla.
Beautiful.
Saskia.
Yeah, in Wolof, I say, Nyofar, on est ensemble. It's an expression we could use also in Benin very often, on est ensemble. But about repatriation question, I think being closer could mean to let people access to the things, to let cultural proppers go to return to their lands. Maybe things might be far away, but people will be closer. And I think we have to think about how the thing can be a way of being closer each other each other. That's it.
Well, thank you, everybody. Miigwech, maybe you want to say thank you in with different words. Anybody?
Bela Kasla.
Merci beaucoup. Jërëjëf. Jërëjëf. Fonongbe, John. That means
Okay.
it's a good job in the language from the Benin.
Well, thank you all so much. And I think it was a great moment and a lot of really fascinating things were said. Till the next time.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for you. We're like prestigious speakers, and it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for responding to the question about clother.
It's the hardest word in English.
Yeah.
I know.
Because it's the bloody TH. It's bloody TH. So
I know, it's complicated. Mais merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Thank you also for people who are watching this live on YouTube as well. So it's going to be available just after we stop this live. Please note that the Night of Ideas will continue on this YouTube channel. So at 5 p.m. There is a live session from Ottawa. And the Night of Ideas here in Toronto will continue at 7 p.m. with an inspiring talk between Kim Thuy and Clément Balou. So stay tuned. Don't hesitate to subscribe to Nuit des Idées Canada. And so this way you won't miss any of the videos coming up for Night of Ideas. Merci beaucoup et bonne nuit des idées.
can I just say, it's not for anybody outside, just to say, are we still on?
No, yeah, we're still on. So we are just going to put the partners. So
Okay, what happened to everybody?
We're all still here.
We needed a full day.
Well,